Growth Pod is brought to you by Genero, a leading growth agency in the Nordics. We interview marketing experts, business leaders, and entrepreneurs to uncover the stories and strategies behind profitable growth.
Anders, thank you so much for joining me.
Yeah, thanks for having me, Josse.
We had some technical issues, so really excited to get started, and hopefully it works. As I was kind of preparing for this interview, I was one thing that stood out to me was the breadth, the scope of the government sort of state-owned portfolio of companies, both publicly listed and completely, privately held, completely owned by the government. So I'd be curious to know just kind of how you, as the minister in charge of it, and how your team is working on managing this portfolio and defining the ownership strategies for each company or asset.
Yeah, as you said, it's a very wide portfolio, and the companies are very different. Some are publicly listed companies where the state holds a share from 6% to 57%. Companies that compete on the market that have other owners, which of course creates for a totally different situation compared to a company that has a special purpose that might not compete on the market with other private companies, and where the state owns the whole company. So the situation is quite different. It calls for a different approach. Of course, to some extent, the legislation is similar, but there are of course also different considerations that needs to be taken into account. There are several people, of course, working at my department, and they all are responsible for a few companies. So, meaning that they focus on those. They follow how the company is performing, how it's managed, how it fares on the market, or how it manages to fulfill the special purpose that we have assigned to that company. Whether it's providing ice-breaking services or helping people to fly from Helsinki to Berlin, for example, quite different purposes. And then, of course, there's a strategy for each company, and that strategy, of course, is evaluated constantly. And here, I think one new consideration is being aware of how the world changes around you. I think it's safe to say that the way we looked at, for example, Finnair 5 years ago is probably quite different compared to how we look at it today, when the whole possibility to fly over Russia has suddenly evaporated, and even though Finland's geographical situation is still the same, our accessibility has suddenly changed totally. So several things have to be taken into consideration.
Got it. Do you think, is there, when it comes to the publicly listed companies, is there typically like a tension between, let's say Finnair as an example, the government wants to guarantee a certain accessibility for Finns to the rest of the world, but Finnair also has other commercial interests. So is there typically or ever like a tension between what the government wants and what the company competing on kind of free market terms would want to achieve?
Yeah. Well, that is of course, one of the challenges when you have the government as an owner, and of course, government, it also means easily politics, and political considerations might be different from what a totally private-owned company might want to do. And here, I think it's important that we keep politics out of the ownership steering, and that's why the ownership steering has, to a large extent, been concentrated under my ministry. So, whereas we have the Ministry of Communications that basically takes care of the regulation around traveling and flying, that's a separate ministry, and I take care of the ownership of the company, meaning that my ownership should be totally detached from the political considerations. And that, of course, also means that it's important that we, as a state owner, make it clear to all the other shareholders that we are a shareholder just as anybody else, that it's not politics that define how we look at the company, but a concern for the company's success, its value, its shareholder value. So, meaning also that we of course have to abide by all the good governance rules. We can't be aware of more than any other shareholder can be aware of. We don't have a special line of communication with the board. We communicate just as any other shareholder would.
Got it. Okay. What do you think? Should there more of the companies that are currently private and completely held or largely held by the Finnish government, should they be publicly listed? I'm thinking about like Gasum, VR, Posti, those kind of companies. Do you think that would be beneficial for the companies if they had a little broader base and maybe some of the scrutiny maybe that comes with public?
No, I think it's something that has to be under constant consideration, and I think that is a thing that we of course continuously evaluate. Is this ownership base ideal for the company, considering the purpose that the company has, the expectations that the government has towards the company, and here, as times change, these considerations also change. We know that, for example, the market where Posti in the mail office is today, it's totally different compared to what it was 20, 30 or 40 years ago in Finland. We suddenly have lots of competitors, international providers of postal services, and so it's not a monopoly anymore. And then of course you could think that, okay, so is it such a function that it needs to be 100% owned by the government or not? And that's why, for example, the Sipilä government did consider taking Posti to the market, as did actually Marin's government too, and it might very well be that this government will also consider it, but as of today there are no such processes ongoing. So I'm just saying that there is I think these are things that we of course constantly evaluate, and I think in many ways it's prudent to be conservative with the ownership, in the sense that if there isn't an obvious need for the state to be involved in a market, then it's probably better to get out of the market. And in many cases, it's better to steer these functions through regulation than maybe ownership.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. I think that's been the trend, or long-term trend, for the Finnish government. I want to just go back to the steering, because I think maybe it's important to kind of just point out some of the things that maybe people have. At least I had my understanding of it was a bit unclear. So let's take Neste as an example, where I think state owns 40% or something like that. Mm-hmm. But it's not the case, like you said, you abide by kind of normal government governance. It's not the case that when the minister gets upset with something that Neste does, you call up the CEO and tell them, hey, back off. Like what does that kind of relationship look like?
Yeah,
in practice?
Yeah, yes. I'll tell you an anecdote first. At the end of the governmental negotiations in June and in May and June last year, I was offered the portfolio of European affairs and ownership steering, and I also got the question, so that if you want to get rid of ownership steering, we can maybe think about something else, because it's considered to be a fairly difficult portfolio, and it usually explodes in the hand of the minister, causing an early exit out of government, because just because of that you mentioned, that there is always there might be a feeling that you need to intervene, that you need to go in and mess with the running matters of the company, and I think that's why it's you need to have a clear philosophy and a clear distance between the operative issues of the company and what is really the domain of the ownership steering. So of course, I want to be informed as any other stockholder of big important things, but my communication happens. I communicate with the chairman of the board that of course can communicate with any other shareholder of the company. And then of course at times I have discussions with the CEO, but I mean corporate governance, I mean the general rules are of course they are relevant to me as to any other shareholder. And I think it's clear that we also clearly communicate to other shareholders that government here isn't a special shareholder. It's a shareholder that of course has a bigger share than any other one, but still, I mean, the same things apply to us as to the rest. Then of course in the shareholders meeting, of course our vote carries the weight of our shares. So in Neste it's around 30%, in Finland and Fortum slightly above 50%, meaning that what we say carries a considerable weight, but it doesn't give us any special rights.
Got it. And I'm guessing that kind of strong communication really helps a company because it kind of gives reassurance to other owners, which may increase demand for the stock and increase stock price and so on.
Yes, and of course, I mean, a common concern is that does government company, is it a negative incentive for others to invest in it? Are they afraid that politics will meddle with the company's affairs in a way that isn't beneficial to the company and to the shareholder value of the company? That's why it's important that we, I mean, communicate that we, of course, abide by these rules and that we are not a special case, even though, of course, our weight through our number of shares is considerable.
One thing that I'd be really interested to get your take on is the topic of state aid and subsidies. You wrote an article early in the spring related to Northvolt, which was the Swedish battery manufacturer. They were going to open a plant in the United States. Germany, the German government gave them a 900 million aid package, 700 million direct and 200 million guarantee to open the factory in Germany instead. And you wrote in your article, you were a bit critical of this and maybe highlighted some fears as it relates to Finland. So what's the issue with us making sure that, you know, this critical infrastructure and knowledge stays within Europe as opposed to being attracted to the United States?
Yeah, I think this is a big concern for Finland and for Sweden actually. And as we are recording this, I had a text in Hufvudstadsbladet and Vasanbladet today, together with Jessica Rosvall, the EU Minister of Sweden, where we discussed actually this very issue, state aid in general and European competitiveness. In Finland, according to Elinkeinoelämän Keskusliitto, the central organization for businesses, really translated, there is an investment potential, or let's say potential like announced investment ideas of around 260 billion in the green transition alone. And those investments are coming to Finland because of the fact that we have pretty much the best electrical grid in the world, I would say. Any given day, the percentage of fossil electricity in our network is countable in the single digits as long as there is some wind somewhere. And this transition has happened without government intervention, essentially. I mean, private companies have invested in renewable energy production. And this gives Finland a tremendous competitive advantage. Many companies want to be fossil-free. They want to invest in the green transition. And Finland and Sweden both actually provide for a really good platform to do those investments. At the same time, in Central Europe, these investments have not been made. Germany, Poland, they are still very reliant on coal and fossil energy. And now we are in a situation in Europe where, on the one hand, we have IRA in the US, the Inflation Reduction Act, heavy subsidy package of anything between $400 billion and $1 trillion. And then on the other hand, a loosening of the state aid rules on a European level, something that we did in order to get out of the COVID COVID crisis, but that has been a system since that. Finland has wanted us to return to the so-called normal state, having strict state aid rules again, but Germany and France want the present exemptions to stay, and this has led then to an inter-European competition between governments, between countries, where we through very generous national aid try to leverage investments from one country to the other. And when this happens, it means that we somehow don't do the investments in the basic infrastructure that we should. We don't do the investments in research and development that we should, but we somehow try to compensate for not doing that, and then give subsidies to production or investments. And that might help in the short term, but I'm really sure that it doesn't help European competitiveness in the long term. And that's why I really hope that we can go back to a normal state and instead, if needed, create mechanisms that incentivize investments in research and development and general investment infrastructure. And I think that's the only way for us to be competitive in the long term. You mentioned Northvolt. Northvolt is a prime example of what this present state might lead to unless we are careful. The German government gave Northvolt a 900 million subsidy. The criteria for that project doesn't meet European standards, and the level of the subsidy isn't even determined within Europe. It's based on matching a supposed American investment subsidy, meaning that we somehow let others decide for ourselves both what we subsidize and how much the subsidy is. And for a country like Finland, this is an impossible race to win. I mean, we are a small country. We have done our homework, but if the game is competing with American subsidies, then we are in trouble. So I really hope that we'll revise our policies and focus on making the single market stronger, and through that play through our strengths, which is being the biggest single market in the world with uniform rules, and while having that as a point of departure, then we invest in research and development and raise competitiveness through that. Sorry for the long rant.
That was very well put. I buy that argument. I just want to highlight something you said to that. You said there's been 260 billion euros announced investments in green transition in Finland. Planned announced investments. So that's kind of like the pipeline.
That's the pipeline, and of course, all of those will not be completed. There's quite a lot of wind power there, and in the short term we don't need that much wind power and so on. But it gives us the scope of the possibility that we have.
Yeah, it's enormous, and like you said, it's been achieved. This competitiveness has been achieved without large subsidies. It's essential, like Finnish innovation and ingenuity and hard work. We are running a little bit low on time, unfortunately. But I want to ask a couple of shorter questions to get your takes on a few specific things. One thing that's been in the news a lot is, of course, the Fortum-Uniper deal, scandal, one might call it. And you were one of the few, I think, in a minority of MPs who were critical of this back in 2017 for issues related to fossil fuels in Russia and so on. So you were critical then, but you also wrote an article you were interviewed end of last year saying that you don't believe that the parliament would have done any different and made a different decision, even if they had the ability to do so. So what do you think, if any, are the lessons that we can learn from the Uniper saga?
I think one lesson is that we can't close our eyes to the risk that doing business with authoritarian states lead to. Was it 16 or 17 when the Uniper deal was announced? I think it was 17. We were, as you said, just a handful of parliamentarians that thought there was a problem. At that point, we knew that Europe has ambitious climate goals, but we also knew that Russia uses energy as leverage. Russia uses energy as a weapon. So I think it was evident that Fortum in this case, put itself at risk, at political risk with regards to Russia. For the same reason, I together with Elina Valtonen and Antero Vartija, a year earlier, we made a written question to the government about the security policy aspects of a Nord Stream 2 pipeline, a project that we also thought was risky for exactly the same reasons. It made Europe more dependent on Russia as a provider of energy in a situation where Russia pretty obviously was fully prepared to use energy as a weapon if it thought it was a relevant way of driving its own political interests. So I think, a liberal democracy like the EU, we of course probably need to trade with lots of countries, and we can't always choose the system that those countries are governed by. But whenever we deal with authoritarian states, we should be aware of the risks involved in dealing with them, and we should be especially careful about creating dependencies where we are not, the stronger partner or the one that can make the choices, but rather a weaker partner with less leverage. So we should be aware of these dependencies and account for them, account for the risks.
Got it. That makes a lot of sense. Another thing that was in the news earlier in this year was the SSAB investment. So they were deciding between the steel manufacturer, deciding between 4.5 billion investment between Luleå, Sweden, and Rahe in Finland. It went to Sweden, the investment, and there's some reasons for that. But what do you think? Did the political strikes that we had in the spring and the beginning of the year impact that? And is that impacting potential billion euro investments in Finland in the future?
Yeah, well, it certainly didn't help. But it's fair to say that when I discussed with the company, with SSAB, they denied that it would have had an impact. I think that you could say that it didn't help, but I also think, and I think if we want to make Finland a more viable country for investments, it's really important that we pass the legislation that was discussed at that point. But the main reason behind it was maybe paradoxically the fact that Rahe was more competitive in its present state than Luleå, meaning that for SSAB it was more viable, or it made sense to first invest in the worst performing plant Luleå compared to the better performing plant Rahe. So paradoxically, being competitive in this case led to Rahe having to wait for this investment. But I'm quite sure that the investment will come eventually, and it's important also for Finland's climate goals. The factory in Rahe by itself accounts for around 7% of Finland's CO2 emissions, so it's a considerable source of emissions. And also from that point of view, it's important that the project will come to fruition eventually. And I'm quite sure it will. And when it does, it's a great opportunity for Finland. This is a booming market and a really huge technological step forward.
Yeah, that sounds. Let's hope that it comes sooner rather than later. One final question for you, Anders, and then you have to run. This is kind of a very broad one, so you can answer it however you want. But when we look west, we have the Norwegians with the biggest sovereign wealth fund in the world, $1.4 trillion in assets, the biggest investor in the world. Then we have some of the Gulf countries, other countries, I think like Singapore, they're using their wealth funds, hundreds of billions, to make strategic investments around the world to position themselves well for the future. So the question is should we, as Finland, be more ambitious when it comes to our state-owned activities of investing and ownership?
I think we very well should be more ambitious. We, of course, compared to Norway, we don't have oil, so there is less of a let's say we have less tools to use in order to build a fund like that. But I think it's worth to plan for the long term. And to some extent, Finland has done it. When you compare our, for example, pension system, it's much more viable than the pension system in many countries. In many countries, it comes straight out of the budget, whereas we have considerable funds behind it. So in that sense, I mean, it's much less than Norway, and it's not comparable. But to some extent, we have similar structures. But of course, I mean, I'd be very happy if we had oil for a few decades and would have a fund like that. And it's worthwhile looking at new oil countries like Guyana, for example, that suddenly found oil and actually are looking at Norway's example. And actually, I talked with the minister from Guyana a few days ago, and he said they are setting up a fund like that. So Norway's example is a good example to follow for many countries.
Yeah, the best decision would have been to have a lot of oil for a lot of decades, as you said.
Yes.
Yeah. Anders, thank you so much for being generous and taking the time to come on the show. Also, huge thanks for all the hard work that you and your team are doing on behalf of all of us Finns. Much appreciated. And best of luck with everything that you got going on.
Yeah, thank you also for having me. I really enjoyed our discussion.
Thank you for listening. You can find all episodes of The Growth Pod on Spotify, YouTube, and Apple Podcasts.